Hi, I'm Randy Wise, curator at the Fremont County Pioneer Museum in Lander. Welcome to our latest Wind River Visitors Council Adventure Trek. Virtual this year because of the unusual circumstances. We're doing all of our treks virtually. Today we are at one of the most prominent early ranches in the Fremont County area, certainly one of the most important in the Lander Valley, the Ed Young Ranch on the Little Poposia, just at the mouth of Red Canyon. A fascinating place. Ed Young's story is amazing, and he is really the apple man of Lander. Edward Young was born in London, England in 1843. He emigrated to the United States, where he worked in the markets of New York City. He enlisted in the Army in 1866. He gained the rank of sergeant, guarding the crews building the Transcontinental Railroad. After witnessing the driving of the Golden Spike in Utah, he was discharged from the Army in 1869 and made his way to the gold fields in the South Pass area. After trying his hand at mining, he settled in the Red Canyon area as a farmer-rancher. He was 27 years old and began acquiring homesteads near his cabin along the Little Poposia, building a large ranch. He ran cattle and raised a wide variety of crops for sale to the miners in the gold district and later to the people in the growing town of Lander. But he had an interest in fruit trees. He planted his first apple trees in 1874, but being from the Midwest, they didn't survive the Wyoming winter. So Ed began experimenting with other breeds and crossbreeding trees to find varieties that could grow here. He ended up using many Russian species that were used to the cold, dry climate. By 1890, Young's orchards had made great progress, and he was winning first place at the state fair. Young was also raising corn, watermelon, potatoes, and strawberries, as well as cattle for sale. By 1894, his orchards were producing 5,000 bushels of apples. Young began experimenting, growing plum, pear, apricot, and peach trees, having some success with pears and plums. Young was very interested in helping other orchards get started and encouraged farmers and townspeople of Lander to plant apple trees. Many of the crab and apple trees that dot Lander lawns came from Ed Young. By 1901, he had 3,000 trees with 17 varieties of apples. Ed worked his orchards into his old age, winning county and state fairs, selling apples in town to local markets, and inviting people to the orchards to pick their own and buy cider from him. Many people made it a day and picnicked along the banks of the river, enjoying the shade of the trees. Ed passed away in 1930 after having been in failing health for several years. The Riverton newspaper wrote, "His orchard was one of the beauty spots in the county. The Ed Young place is known to almost everyone in the county. Many folks seeking a day's outing have visited there, and many became personally acquainted with Mr. Young." We're standing in front of what Ed Young called the Apple Barn, which is the place he stored apples as well as making apple cider. If you look at this building, you'll notice that it is made out of rough-hewn logs. These logs are also from Camp Stambaugh. Camp Stambaugh was a military post built in the Sweetwater Mining District up at South Pass in 1870 to protect the miners who were flooding into the area from Native Americans. Camp Stambaugh was active from about 1870 to 1878 when the military decommissioned it. And when the military decommissioned it, they sold the buildings to people that wanted them because they were abandoning the post. So Ed Young and many other Lander Valley people bought the logs or the buildings from Camp Stambaugh and moved them to their properties where they reused them. Ed Young's house, original house, was made out of logs from Camp Stambaugh, and so was the apple barn. Again, the apple barn was used to store apples initially, and then he had to add additional storage later. But he also had his apple cider press in here. An interesting story about the apple barn is that Ed would advertise when the harvest time came, you want to bring your jugs or your kegs, you can fill them up at the apple cider barn. We're standing in front of Ed Young's house. Obviously it's changed over the years. There have been additions built onto it, and it has been cited that this is one of the buildings that is built from logs from Camp Stambaugh, the military post up at South Pass. When Ed built this place, he recycled essentially the logs from the old fort that the military was selling. It takes 2 years for an apple seed to produce a seedling, 2 to 4 years to make a sapling, and 5 to 8 years to become a tree with apples. Ed originally ordered sapling trees from a nursery in Ohio, but they arrived in such bad condition they did not survive the first winter. He then ordered apple trees from a Utah nursery that were already 6 years old. The roots of the saplings were wrapped in wet burlap and shipped on the Union Pacific Railroad to Rock Springs. They were then loaded on a wagon and hauled 120 miles to Ed's ranch in Red Canyon. This trip took more than a month. Ed received 6 different kinds of apple trees and 2 kinds of crabapple trees, all of which proved successful in producing apples. Although none of these varieties can be found in our grocery stores today, they were great for storage, for making apple juice, and for cooking and baking. Hi, we're standing at the bank of the Little Pocosia River coming down out of the Wind River Mountains. This is one branch of the Pocosia drainage. The middle fork of the Pocosia runs through Lander, and the north fork of the Pocosia is north of Lander. This little stream provides water for wildlife and people and agriculture in this part of the area. So Ed Young needed water for his apple trees and the rest of the things he was growing. Of course, the river is quite a ways down from where we're standing. So Ed, being a very ingenious and creative fellow, came up with the idea of a large water wheel to literally lift the water up and put it into his irrigation ditches. He built by hand and by himself this very large, over 20-foot tall water wheel. The wheel is long gone, but we do have some pictures of it that will be part of this video. But Ed used that water wheel to get water from the Little Pocosia up to his orchards. The water wheel itself became a tourist attraction. People would come out to his orchards for apple cider or to pick apples or to buy apples, but everybody always wanted to see that water wheel because it was quite an impressive feat of engineering. By 1895, Ed Young had between 2,000 and 3,000 apple trees in his orchard. Over 1,000 of them were of the wealthy variety. There were also large numbers of the following varieties: Titovsky, McMahon, Wolf River, Hibernial, Duchess of Oldenburg, Yellow Transparent, Patton's Greening, and various crabapple varieties. This structure is the dugout, a large root cellar Ed Young dug into the hillside to store his apples and other produce. Apples will keep well into the winter if stored properly in a cool, controlled environment. The dugout was essentially a cave and kept a steady temperature, making the apples available for applesauce, cider, and pies year-round. We're standing in front of some of the original orchards here at the Ed Young Ranch. At one point, Ed had as many as 3,000 trees, and he was producing up to 5,000 bushels of apples per year. And he stored them in various places. There was the apple barn. He also stored them in the dugout that he had built into the side of the mountain. Ed sold most of his apples in Lander or to the South Pass miners. Once the railroad came to Lander, Ed's market expanded considerably, so after 1906 he was able to sell apples statewide and region-wide. Ed really was dedicated to growing apples in the Lander region and really promoted that. Eventually other orchards started in the Lander Valley, a few up in Sinks Canyon. Most people in Lander had at least one apple tree, if not 2, and they often came from Ed Young, who was happy to sell shoots to people to get apples started in the valley. Ed really was behind the idea that Lander becomes the Apple City of Wyoming, and for a long time, from about 1900 to about 1920, that was what Lander was known as, the Apple City of Wyoming, because it really was the only place in Wyoming that grew apples. Ed's apples were so good that he actually won a gold medal at the St. Louis World's Fair for his apples, which is saying a lot for a small producer in Wyoming to go up against all the big orchards from back east and take home the gold medal. It was quite an accomplishment for Ed. Crabapple varieties are small, up to 2.5 inches in diameter, and mostly sour to the taste. Apples are larger, up to 6 inches in diameter, and mostly sweet to the taste. A mixture of crabapples and apples make the best flavored cider. Today we can see crabapple trees all over the Lander Valley. They do very well here. Some of the crabapple varieties that Ed Young grew were the Whitney, Transcendent, Highslop, and Briar's Sweet. Ed Young was interested in many kinds of trees. He didn't just grow apple trees and plum trees and try many other species, but he was interested in cottonwood trees as well. Cottonwood trees grow in Wyoming, and they grow well in Wyoming. Ed cultivated them to have tall, straight trunks. He felt that Lander in particular would benefit from having trees to shade the houses and shade the streets. So he was very interested in growing cottonwoods that would grow tall and straight. This is a line of them and the entrance to his property. He grew the cottonwood trees here, planted them on his property, but he also sold them to people in Lander who wanted cottonwood trees. So as you walk around Lander, you'll see many tall lines of stately cottonwood trees. Likely they came from Ed Young's ranch. Thank you for joining us today on our latest Wind River Visitors Council Adventure Trek. We'd like to thank the Wind River Visitors Council that their sponsorship allows us to take people to interesting places around Fremont County. All of our museums are terrific and we have wonderful collections, but sometimes it's nice to go to the actual site where the history happened. Hopefully in the future we'll be able to do these live again, but this summer obviously we're doing things virtually. I'd also like to thank Nan Slingerland for allowing us the opportunity to visit the Ed Young Orchards and Ranch. We appreciate her forbearance in letting us traipse around her property. Again, this is private property, so it isn't open to the public, so please always get permission if you're going to visit places like this.
Lander Apple Orchards. Apple blossoms, what a sight. Orchards blooming, everywhere branches fair in pink and white, swaying in the sweet spring air. But the fragrant blossoms fell, tinted snow on the Maytime green. Summer saw the young fruit swell, growing in her sun and sheen. Autumn's golden days are here. Reap the harvest, glean the field, bring you home with joy and cheer, all the orchard's generous yield. Apples, apples everywhere, apple sour or apple sweet, glowing red or glowing fair, and everyone is good to eat.